Hello and welcome to Demand Better. Today we're going to be talking about the NDP Climate Plan and doing a little simple breakdown because the Canadian media is covering it terribly. This is a volunteer effort. I've worked for the Ontario NDP in the past, but I've never worked for the federal, and I am not currently employed by them in any capacity. So this is just a labor of, you could say, love, but it's probably more annoyance from seeing all the misinformation flowing around about these different plans. So, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the way that this is being covered by the media, a lot of the media is trying to paint it as that, there's not really much there, there's not really much of a plan, but they set high targets at least. They're saying that they're going to be ambitious, but there's not really much there. That's not accurate at all. They have a lot more there than the other parties do, but that isn't the impression that you would be given if you looked at things like right here. This is the CBC comparison of the party platforms, and it mentions all these things going into some detail with the Liberals. It mentions even more things on the Conservative section just because they have to sort through the nuance of, the Conservatives basically trying to stake a position that doesn't actually hurt any of the carbon industries that are their allies. And then the New Democrats, it makes it look an awful lot like even, like they don't have a whole lot there. And you'll see that that's not accurate, even slightly. So we'll move on. The first thing we need to talk about is the cost of climate change and pollution. So we already pay the taxes that cover the costs of polluting industries. Without a pollution price, we pay 100% as the billionaires push all the costs onto the public. The low estimate of pollution's costs to us was $43.3 billion just in 2015, according to Smith and McDougall 2017, though the real figures are unknown and are likely above $100 billion annually, because wealth destruction was not able to be accounted for. We don't know how much wealth is being destroyed in the disasters, the floods, the wildfires, these things that are being made worse by climate change, and adaptation is required in order for us to deal with them. Yeah, that's all going to cost money, and that money's going to come out of your pocket if we aren't taxing and putting these costs onto the polluters. So, if you think about it, pollution increases costs for healthcare, the single greatest provincial burden and the fastest growing one. Infrastructure, as we repair, adapt, and build in preparation of, or more expensively, in reaction to the climate crisis. And property destroyed by natural disasters or environmental degradation. So we are paying billions as taxpayers right now. And up until the 2019 carbon tax was instituted, there simply wasn't any cost being put onto the polluters at all. So one of the earliest questions that is often asked is, how are we going to pay for all of this investment in the economy? Investment is obviously inherently good for the economy, but where is all this money going to come from? Now, this is often the wrong question because we end up paying a lot more for climate change if we take a reactive stance rather than a preventative stance. If we can prevent as much damage as possible, then we ultimately are going to save a lot more money and a lot more, build a lot more wealth than if we sort of just pretend that, the costs of shifting off fossil fuels are too great. That's going to damage our economy, not the forest fires and tsunamis and refugee crises and everything else. Those aren't going to be the issue. So, ultimately, wrong question, but let's answer it. The public banks, not taxpayers, will bear much of the debt from the NDP's investments. And I'm going to go into that a lot more detail in the next slide. As well as, they're going to be shifting the tax burden from workers back towards corporations and rich people where it's supposed to be, with higher corporate and wealth taxes that are a lot more fair to the average person who is currently paying a higher percentage of tax than a lot of wealthy people. So the next thing is we're going to improve the way that the funds are being spent. Right now, we're going to stop paying rich people to pollute. In 2020, the LibCon corporate welfare system, set up by both parties, gave $18 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel lobby after buying a pipeline in 2018 for $4.5 billion. Can you imagine the incredible investments in a whole range of areas of our economy that we could have afforded if we hadn't been giving money to rich people to pollute our air? Oof. Seems like a bad idea. The NDP is going to spend this money on transition instead of tying our economy closer to an industry that's dying and taking the planet with it. So, next question. The Climate Bank. Oh, this is the public bank that I was mentioning earlier. So basically, it can create money. This is something that honestly, the NDP needs to bring it up more and needs to kind of explain it, because this is going to be one of the main things that keeps the deficit low and makes it so that we can invest a lot of money into the economy. So the Climate Bank can create money similar to a private bank, but instead it gives low interest loans to the many underinvested communities and services that we all rely on. It's administered much more locally by and to municipalities, regions, provinces, as well as by the federal government. It's also accessible to nonprofits, cooperatives, and small businesses, and possibly large businesses too. I actually couldn't quite find confirmation of that. But honestly, if a large business is asking for a loan to invest in greenifying like a bunch of their plants or something, then there's a good chance that this would be where that money could come from. So this increases the capacity of our whole economy to create green jobs, because right now there are plenty of green jobs that could be created, but there is no bank offering loans on the basis of green jobs. This would be that bank. The fact is, we already have public banks that are kind of similar to this, but they usually have a narrowed mandate, like the Export Development Corporation, which gives out tons of loans, mostly to fossil fuel companies, because that's one of the main things we export. So right now, our federal government, through a public bank, is giving out loans that essentially that increase our carbon output. So this would just be a bank that does the literal opposite of that. So they either have a very narrowed mandate, so developing exports, or they rely on private investors, like a public-private partnership, instead of it just being all publicly owned, publicly controlled. Basically, all the profit goes back to the people. Instead, you have a bunch of private investors who have also put their money in the bank, and now they demand a high return on investment, because they won't put their money in the bank if it's not competitive with other places they could put their money. Ultimately, we already have things similar to this. They've just never been directed in a way to create green jobs and just absolutely boost the economy. And ultimately, it would create an economic boom. We would turn a crisis into a boom. So, create 1 million jobs spread across the country, funding municipal, regional, provincial, and community projects that have gone underfunded for decades. Keep in mind, your property taxes are high, largely because conservative provincial governments across the country, and probably some liberals, I haven't actually checked if the liberals have done it as well, but nearly always the conservatives have downloaded costs onto your local community that now your city has to fund with higher property taxes. They forced everyone else to raise your taxes or your costs or your fees. Ultimately, there's a lot of ways to sneak a tax increase in on you. We are the only ones who are telling you who is going to be taxed: the rich. So, underinvested fields like childcare, where we know that there's needs for literally thousands of spaces across the country, and there's tons of workers, and the workers are currently being underpaid, and there's just not enough spaces. There's been no investment in this field. So if banks aren't going to do it, we need a bank that will. We need a government that will step in. Affordable housing. But ultimately, 500,000 units, a lot of those are going to be local projects by municipal governments who recognize the need for extra housing in certain areas. They have the most information on that. So it is actually pretty helpful to give access to the funds to the local governments. As well, clean and improved transits. Investment in jobs in growing fields of the future, like renewable energy, retrofitting, I think, most or all of the buildings in Canada, and planting millions of trees, greening agriculture, as well as building the infrastructure needed to prepare for climate change. There are so many jobs, and these are the jobs of the future. But right now, the other parties are just not committing as much money to these things as the NDP is willing to. The NDP is also willing to hold the polluters accountable, funding regulators so that climate laws are followed, or that perpetrators are fined enough that they fund the regulator going forward. Right now, libs and cons pass laws that there are too few cops to enforce. So they look good because they passed the right law, but there's no actual cops on that beat because they defunded the regulators. Then, so the NDP, even just by funding the regulators, we will make a bunch of money off of the companies that have gotten used to being able to just break the law at will because there's no cops. Force big oil to pay for the inactive wells that they've abandoned across Canada, cutting a big source of the water pollution that keeps re-poisoning Indigenous communities. We're going to hold companies, I say we, I'm not in the NDP technically, I just think this is the best plan. Hold companies accountable for the entire life cycle of plastic products and packaging, improve recycling standards, and waste management in municipalities. That's sort of basic. To be honest, I'm leaving an enormous number of things out on this file and on the next file. Because there's just too many things to mention, and the NDP has a pretty thorough document that really does get down to the details. I'm surprised that a lot of journalists don't seem to be able to parse it and figure out what it's saying. But they say a lot of stuff, so I'm admittedly even leaving a lot of stuff out. I'm just putting in things that I think, are sort of obviously good ideas that, like, why are we not? Oh my God. Carbon pricing. So this is partially even just a defense of, like, carbon pricing is just a basic idea. It's a way to make the polluters pay for the climate change, rather than by making it so that they pay a tax, and then that tax makes it directly into your pocket. So it compensates everyone for the rising costs created by climate change. This makes sense. However, it's not high enough to actually cover the costs that are being created by climate change. As we mentioned, they are at least $43.3 billion. So there is no way that our current... what even is it right now? Like $50? Like $70? Like, that is nowhere near enough to do what is necessary to get us the money that's being taken from us by these polluting industries. So, by itself, this liberal carbon price, it does not reduce emissions enough to meet Canada's goals. The NDP will continue to increase the carbon price, at least until it catches up with the expected costs of pollution and adaptation. They'll roll back the current loopholes for heavy emitters that undermine the entire point of having a carbon tax, because the people who pollute the most are the ones who are often paying less than other companies. And finally, the NDP will impose a border adjustment tax that keeps us internationally competitive. This means that imports from other countries without a comparable carbon tax will have us tax them for the emissions instead. So our businesses stay competitive, we get basically a carbon tax from the rest of the world, and ultimately, this is an extremely good idea that the Liberals have only recently adopted themselves. The final thing that we're going to be discussing today is the ambitious environmental standards that the NDP are fighting for. And I think that an important part of this is that they're supporting First Nations in their continued leadership in nature conservation. First Nations have been the most successful conservationists in Canadian history and before. They were able to manage the forests to prevent forest fires in a way that we seem to not be able to anymore. So let's talk about other ways that the NDP is going to be protecting the environment and biodiversity. They're going to be creating a whole new host of national parks. They're going to be expanding protected areas. They're going to be creating urban green space. Now, this is very important because ultimately, we do not want to be in a concrete jungle that sucks out our life and makes us unhappy. It is very important to fight for urban green space. They have a national freshwater and ocean strategy to protect 30% of the waterways, oceans, lakes, and coastlines by 2030, preserving hundreds of unique species, some of which are probably totally undiscovered at this point. Major investments in forest management, reforestation, selective cutting, and this is to hopefully end forest fire season that the libcons expect us to just get used to. That's not such a good thing. But it's not just forests that we're going to be growing. We're going to be looking at how we can reduce the carbon imprint at every stage of your food's production and consumption. So we're going to be looking at green agriculture. There's a whole bunch of ways that we can reduce the carbon output of our agricultural system and use it for carbon sequestration using like hemp and other plants that absorb carbon very quickly from the air. They're looking at local food hubs to make sure that your food, if possible, can be made locally, can be gotten to you locally, so we can reduce the amount of carbon that's going into the air for the purpose of transportation, and a national food waste strategy similar to places like France, where literally grocery stores and other food vendors are not allowed to waste food. They have to essentially distribute it before it goes bad. And they will. There are a whole bunch of ways that the NDP can make this not only work for businesses, but essentially end hunger in Canada at the same time as ending food waste, potentially. I don't know. That sounds like a good idea, maybe. So, we hope to reduce carbon at every stage of that process. And that's all of the things that we've just listed, and also a bunch of things I didn't have time to list. All of those things are how they plan to reach the target of reducing the emissions by at least 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. Only the Greens, Communists, and NDP have an assertive plan that acknowledges the climate reality. And the NDP have the best shot at winning government. So I think, ultimately, for the environment, it's pretty clear who you have to vote for, or should vote for. Not have to, obviously. I have no power here, just knowledge. Oh, that was a bad ending. Please like and subscribe. Wait, okay, no. That was a genuinely bad ending. I'm not going to end that there. Wait,